Happy Friday, everybody. James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 2 of season 5 of The Boys, an episode called We Gotta Go Now. And I think this is one of the strongest episodes yet because this episode featured so many of the key ingredients that set a show like The Boys apart from other conventional kind of mainstream superhero stories. We had some horrific gore, we had a super-powered sex scene, we had some brilliant social satire. I think this show still has a lingering problem where the villains are much more interesting than the heroes, but on the whole, I think this episode was very satisfying. Also, fair warning, I will be going into spoilers and details, so if you haven't seen the show yet, this is not the video to be watching. But I think the secret formula to this episode's success is writer Ellie Monahan, and I was unfamiliar with her work prior to now, but she just really seems to get the Boys formula, as opposed to the writer of episode 4, who I think completely does not get it. I mean, episode 4 was fine on the whole. However, there were several scenes where I just wanted to dunk my head in hydrochloric acid because they betrayed the brand or the flavor of The Boys by giving us scenes that I would describe as cute. The Boys should never be cute. You should never have scenes where people are sitting around talking about ice cream and sugar. And episode 4 had 3 separate scenes where people were talking about sugar. But the scene that about broke me is when we saw Huey and Starlight singing the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire, and Huey was kind of geeking out in the back of the car and getting all excited. I already had a problem with the character Huey, but now I'm really actively rooting for someone like Black Noir or Homelander to just burn him down where he stands. Obviously, it's the start of the show. That's not going to happen. But as I mentioned before, the show has a strange problem where the villains are so much more charismatic, have much more interesting story arcs. It's kind of the reverse problem of the MCU, where historically the MCU struggled with creating great, memorable villains. Obviously, everybody loves Loki, everybody loves Thanos. But over the last 10 years or so, I would say the MCU has done a much better job of fleshing out the heroes, while a lot of the villains kind of seem like an afterthought. In any event, let's talk about all the things that made this episode so distinctive. For me, episode 5 was at its strongest when I was indulging in some serious social satire. We have some great scenes on the set where they're shooting 7 Dawn of the Seven. And we also have a fantastic scene with the Deep doing a public service announcement for the Church of the Collective. And I just love how both of these scenes depict this corporate way of thinking that's so transparent and so obvious that anybody with any media savvy of any kind can see right through them. And I just found myself cracking up at how cynical the show is becoming. And I just thought it was hysterical. Pretty much each scene that was being shot on the set of Dawn of the Seven, they insisted upon making each and every single scene about identity or gender or sexual orientation. Almost like the studio behind the film is quite literally checking off boxes, trying to make different groups happy. And what made me laugh even harder was watching the Homelander trying to get on board, because obviously the Homelander, he's a corporate animal, but he doesn't quite get this new philosophy. And as he's watching the playback of a scene that they just filmed, he's kind of nodding in approval and says, yeah, girls, get it on. And then he immediately gets corrected by Ashley, who's like, no, girls, get it done. And I don't want to get too lost in the weeds over analyzing why a particular joke works, because that's the fastest way to break a joke. But what's great about that scene is how on one hand, it illustrates how out of touch the character of the Homelander is. On the other hand, it pokes fun at corporate thinking all at once, and great satire should make fun of everybody equally. That's what makes it satire. If you're only making fun of one side, that's propaganda. And then just to hammer home the girls get it done bit, we immediately have a scene with Queen Maeve and Starlight and Stormfront quite literally saying girls get it done in a scene. And what it reminded me of was that scene with all the female characters at the end of Avengers Endgame, and it just shows the writer Ellie Monahan really gets it. She understands what makes these big, giant mainstream superhero franchises work and what makes them tick. And on the other hand, she recognizes that The Boys is a show that should be the counterpoint to mainstream superhero movies. It should make fun of mainstream superheroes. It should ridicule mainstream superheroes. And the moment that The Boys tries to be more like the Avengers and less like The Boys, the show will lose that special quality that makes the show unique. And another scene which illustrated the show's incredible media savvy is when the Deep is doing this public service announcement for the Church of the Collective. It reminded me quite a bit of that controversial Gillette commercial, which came out like last year or the year before. I can't even keep track of all the controversies anymore. But we see him walking through a series of scenarios where boys are behaving inappropriately, and we see this one guy who's getting a little handsy with a girl, and he says, hey man, that's not cool. And then he sees some other boys roughhousing, he's like, hey boys, knock it off. And it was just so cheesy and so lame. But this is the kind of crap that brands like Gillette do all the time. And for me, it's just a breath of fresh air having a show like The Boys very cynically and very effectively poke fun at the very obvious corporate messaging and that kind of media. But all satire aside, one thing The Boys always needs to have is just generous heaps of sex and violence. Because if this show isn't taking risks on that front, then it's kind of forgotten what the show's all about. And there was one moment that absolutely blew my mind where Kamiko's taking on some Russians, and she kicks this guy in the nuts and reaches around and tears off his face, but she doesn't completely cleanly tear off his face. She kind of leaves like a little bit of skin on, and somehow that little extra bit of skin just made it all seem so much worse. But when it comes to SEX, we had a very interesting scene between Stormfront and the Homelander, who are forming this uneasy alliance after she helps him improve his numbers after this disastrous press conference that totally turns against him. She really gets internet culture, she gets meme culture. And while we as the audience know that Stormfront has a very different agenda, clearly that agenda at some point is going to incorporate Homelander. And also, quick side note, this is actually the second show this week that has shown people having sex while floating. There was a scene like that in Raised by Wolves yesterday, but what made this scene so special between Homelander and Stormfront is that they're basically two omnipotent beings who are impossible to harm, and so they're kind of fucking and fighting all at once. She demonstrates how resilient she is early on by having him blast her in her tits with his heat vision, even kind of taunting him and goading him and insulting him to make him go all out. At any rate, they totally trashed the room in their throes of passion, and I thought it was the perfect way to bring the episode to a close. But there's another scene with the Homelander that came close to becoming my all-time favorite scene in the history of the show, but it turned out to be a pump fake, which I thought was a little bit of a cop-out when the Homelander's trying to address an unruly crowd. No matter what he says, he just seems to make them more and more agitated, and they're giving him the finger and talking all kinds of trash. And we see him getting increasingly frustrated because he's used to having the adoration and the love of the people. And finally, he just snaps and just incinerates the majority of the crowd with his heat vision. And I was just screaming with laughter because I thought we were finally going to see a situation where the Homelander just embraces the fact that he's a supervillain, and that we might see a situation where the Seven is sent after Homelander to take him down. And I don't want to get into too much spoiler territory from the comics, but it would have been a cool way to lead into some of the ingredients that fans of the comic know and love. But as it turns out, it was all in his mind, so sadly for now, the show does not appear to be willing to unleash the beast when it comes to Homelander revealing to the world who he truly is. But as a fan of some of the more juvenile humor from the comics, it was a relief to see some scenes this episode where we're introduced to Tara's girlfriend, a little stuffed animal, who Billy Butcher's mother refers to as his fuck pig. And toward the end of the episode, Butcher gives him a new animal to play with. And a lot of people are going to say, oh, but that's just adolescent humor. However, it's very true and faithful to the style of humor in Garth Ennis' original comic. I'm not demanding that people like it, but if you're going to adapt a comic like Garth Ennis' The Boys, stay true to the spirit of the comic, even if you're not going to follow the specific story. But as much as I enjoyed this episode, I do have some criticisms, and I maintain that this season hasn't done as good of a job at fleshing out the boys and making them the stars of their own show. Frenchie and Kimiko are barely in the show. Their storylines almost appear to be an afterthought. Mother's Milk and Huey are being put to better use. But that whole scene with them camping out in the basement of Billy Butcher's mother's house while trying to distract Black Noir and get him off their trail, the scene didn't even really make sense. How they call in all these fire trucks to try to create a distraction so that if Black Noir were to kill him, he'd have to do so in front of a crowd. But then the boys just hang out in the basement and wait for Black Noir to attack. Strategically, it just didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And here we are 5 episodes deep into season 2, and we still haven't really seen the boys really get an opportunity to kick ass. In the comics, we only had to wait a couple issues before we saw the boys take some Compound V and just wreak havoc, beating the crap out of some low-level superheroes. It was just an absolute money shot moment. And if we get to the end of season 2 without a scene like that, I'm going to be incredibly disappointed, because this show is The Boys. This show is not The Seven. And right now, The Seven are clearly the stars of this show. And I have no problem with the characters of The Seven being as well-written and charismatic as they are. But the writers need to give just as much love and affection to the members of The Boys, because after all, this is their show. And I know a lot of people out there are absolutely irate over the release strategy for this show, and I wouldn't say I share their frustration, but I think they could have done it better. I've been a big fan of the release plan of Raised by Wolves, where they release 3 episodes on the first day and then 2 episodes every subsequent week. So at least you're getting like a 2-hour movie-length experience every week. But making fans of The Boys wait a week in between hour-long episodes, clearly it worked in the case of The Mandalorian, but I don't think it's necessarily helping The Boys. And I'm thinking a release plan more like Raised by Wolves probably would have worked to its advantage. In any event, I remain a massive fan of the show. I think Season 2 is stronger than Season 1, and I just can't wait to see what the show is cooking in the oven for the next 3 episodes. In any event, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. If you want to talk more about The Boys or superheroes or whatever, give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax, or leave me a comment in the comments below. Can't thank you enough for watching the video. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.